The problem is you do see a lot of antisocial people succeed. Loneliness is as big a risk factor for ill health and death.
We live inside our heads.
You go cold turkey, you go into withdrawal.
There is a lot of value in the stuff that we struggle with.
Better Thinking. Conversations with experts exploring all things psychology. Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name's Nesh Nikolic, and my guest today is Professor Margaret Morris, here to talk to us about diet and cognition, the impact of unhealthy diet, and the gut-brain axis. What is so fascinating about this conversation today is Margaret's approach to her research using the naturalistic approach or the naturalistic model, which I think replicates the Western world exceptionally well. And I think many findings come out of that, or at least considerations that wouldn't necessarily always come through in other types of research. Hope you enjoy this episode. Margaret, a big thank you for coming onto the show today. I'm very excited to take a bit of a deep dive into this space around diet and cognition, the gut-brain axis, and how there's so much interrelated space through, how we feed ourselves, our mental health, projections on life, and so many aspects. So really appreciate you taking the time.
You're very welcome.
How did you get into this space? I always ask guests because I'm intrigued where the passion comes from.
I've been working on the brain for quite a while, since I was a PhD student, really, and I'm a self-trained neuroscientist. I began as a biochemist. I think about big health problems. So cardiovascular disease was a major focus, and then I moved into obesity because the molecule I was working on, NPY, is a really potent appetite stimulant. And I mean, for 30 years now, we've been trying to find solutions to obesity. And that's where I began, really looking at actions of substances like NPY in the hypothalamus. But I realized that there was a much bigger issue at stake, and that was around the foods that we're eating and what their impact is on the body. So I began looking at that about 25 years ago, I guess.
And how does one go about doing that? Is it looking at conducting research? Is it looking at the makeup of foods and how they interact with the body? At what level have you been involved in that?
I set out to develop a naturalistic model of the Western environment that's changed so much in the last, 50 or so years, whereby we're now exposed to foods that are high in energy, palatable, and high in saturated fats and sugar. So they're very hard for us to resist. And they're really omnipresent. They're all around us, ubiquitous. It's hard to avoid them.
Mm.
And so we've set up experiments where we have animals, and we use mainly rats, that are fed either a healthy diet, which is a sort of chow that you see at pet shops, highly controlled, high fiber, healthy amount of protein. And we contrast that with animals that are offered the same food, but they're also offered snacks and foods that are from the supermarket, in fact, the sort of things that we like to eat, like meat pies and chips and cakes and dim sims and biscuits. We do it in a controlled way so that we know that we weigh the amount that's eaten, we know the fat, carbohydrate and protein amounts that animals are eating, so we can measure what is eaten, measure the effects on the body, as well as the behavioural impact, for instance, and then track over time the consequences of that intake at multiple levels. So we can look at blood hormones, we can look at blood sugar, we can look at glucose tolerance, we can look at changes in the brain. So we've shown many changes in gene expression in areas such as the hypothalamus, where appetite is controlled, but also hippocampus, where memory is regulated to some extent. So I think as a consequence of this approach, I think what's fascinating is if you give healthy animals the choice of those foods, everybody eats it. But there's no, and I think it's kind of it's an analogy of what we're exposed to currently, whereby those foods are, we might say they're heavily marketed. I think that's a truism. They're made to be very appealing. And I've been shopping for them for 25 years. And I think what's striking to me is the so-called discretionary snack junk foods are often relatively affordable.
Yes.
And they're possibly becoming cheaper, relative to healthy foods. And so it becomes a very difficult position. And I think of people, without much discretionary income, if you have to feed a family and you can buy a packet of meat pies, I mean, it used to be $3.60. That's emblazoned on my brain. It's now probably $5 or $6. It feeds a family. It's not particularly good, but it's reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
So these foods are compelling in many ways, not just because they're palatable, but they're also affordable.
What's interesting, sorry to jump in, is that your work's replicating that Western lifestyle, and as I'm sure over time you've looked at this as well, as the world has changed over the last 25 so years, the selection is greater and greater. There are more items you can go for. So not everything's necessarily going to be affordable or cheap, but there will be another alternative, or there'll be something in the next aisle that is affordable and cheap that is still within that discretionary food category. And so if someone can't afford, a particular type of meat pie, there will be a cheap alternative of sausage rolls. There's enough range and selection that it's reasonably affordable for everyone to find these discretionary discretionary foods that are high in calories, sugars, cholesterol, and so on. So it's interesting how it sounds to me like you're making little cities, little towns, little opportunities to see what it would actually look like, and in some sense, it's a really strong replication of what Western life is like. With that choice.
Yeah, exactly. And we know that many of us eat those foods. Australian data suggests that we're eating around a third of our calories come from those types of foods. And the other statistic that's quite scary, I think, is that only 5% of us currently eat the recommended amounts of fruit and vegetables daily. And that's enormously important for fibre intake, as well as, general health.
That's a very low number. Are there any moderators that are both toward the fruit and veg, toward the eating more fiber, and the moderators that are against, as you sort of look at learning and trying to study, or what are the behaviors that your experiments have shown? Because you mentioned that once there's an introduction of more variety, there's more of a pool and more of those foods being eaten that are in that discretionary category.
Yes. So I think the choice aspect is important here, because the number of foods available to us humans has exponentially increased over the last 50 years. And again, there's interesting human evidence that if you give people the choice between two food items that are actually identical, but they're made to look different, think of yourself at a smorgasbord or something. all of us tend to eat too much if we're offered choice. But experiments that show that the same item made to look different, that it doesn't taste any different, it's factually the same, people will eat more of it because they think it's different. So again, so maybe that's important. But the other moderator is liquid intake. So if you drink high energy, high sugar sweetened beverage equivalents, you tend to eat more calories and you tend to gain more fat, and your inflammatory mediators go up. So the combination might be unhelpful. A positive moderator is something like physical activity. So burning the energy, expending calories is useful, not just for intake and output measures, but also for other biological readouts.
How are these experiments run, if you don't mind me asking? And the reason for the question is comes from my curiosity around some fairly well-known research now around rat park, if you are familiar with that, where the use of, for example, heroin or heroin water versus clean water, and how that's used by rats when they're in isolation and they have nothing to do, and they feel captive because all of their choices are taken away, versus it's moderated when they're in a community. So when they're engaging with other rats and they're chasing one another, and there's activities and there's running wheels and there's mazes and there's food and maybe choice of foods and there's sex to be had, and there's a social hierarchy and all sorts of things that are occurring. There's a moderating feature around how they use heroin or where they come off heroin. Fairly well-known experiment. How are your and I'm sure you've done lots of different research lab setups. How do you do your setup to look at these factors?
Because rats are social animals, we co-house them with buddies. And we find it's best at around 3 animals per cage, so we don't get too much dominance or hierarchy. And we find over the years we've had remarkably stable behaviour of the animals in terms of the amount they overeat. So if we look at net energy intake, our animals eat more than double the calories if they're eating that cafeteria diet option versus the controlled diet. That's remarkably consistent. We got a bit better over the years at, getting the offerings right. And again, I stress that they always have healthy food available. They eat only about 10% of their energy as that option, and that's fairly consistent as well. So you're absolutely correct about the effects of your buddies. We know that humans, if we go out with our mates who overeat, we tend to overeat ourselves. So there's a moderating influence on us. And if people eat healthily around us, we tend to eat healthily. We have done an experiment that's not yet published. In fact, Mike Kendig in the lab tested this. We put animals in a single cage because we wanted to see how they would vary across individuals. And remember, rats are outbred, so there's a bit of genetic diversity amongst them. We're using an outbred strain. We were amazed by how similar overall the amount of energy excess was across those animals. They could still, smell and talk to each other through the caging, but food intake was singly done. So we're still crunching the data to see if there's individual differences in the macronutrients that might affect some of the behaviours we observe, because we haven't touched on this yet, but we're interested in the anxiety-like behaviours and particularly the cognitive effects of these diets, because we know that in humans an unhealthy diet is associated with increased inflammation, including in the brain, but also diet is connected to cognition and memory performance. And so in our rats, the unhealthy foods do impact hippocampal-dependent memory. So a spatial memory task is affected by consumption of that unhealthy diet.
Wow. So you would have a control group, an experimental group, control the foods, get them to perform the task and measure the difference, or potentially do a pre and post after you change the diet, and you see, a decline when the rate of discretionary foods goes up.
Yes, the intake of the food is linked to impaired hippocampal dependent memory measured using a novel place task, where an animal explores objects in an arena, and rats are curious, so they explore the objects. So you do a exposure to the two objects, and then you take the animal away, put it back in the same arena. But if you shift one of those objects to a new location, the animal will explore the shifted object because they know that it's moved. They remember where it was and they go to the new place. And a control animal on a healthy diet will do exactly that. They'll spend about 70% of their time exploring the new object, whereas animals eating that diet will not remember as well, and so they'll spend more time exploring both objects.
Wow.
So, and the method allows us to test a non-hippocampal task as well, where we give them a new toy to look at, and that task seems to be preserved. So we have a specific effect on one type of memory of the diet, and it's interesting because that's hippocampal dependent, that task, and there's evidence in humans that those people who report eating greater amounts of junk foods on self-report have lower volumes of their hippocampus on fMRI. So there's evidence published, colleagues from Melbourne have shown that, and they've also shown effects over time if people consume that diet. So there seems to be some parity there around our hippocampal effect in the rat and what might be going on in humans. And this is, of course, relevant to cognitive decline in all of us, because it seems the case that those who are on a Mediterranean healthy type diet with low saturated fats and high fibre, especially at middle age and beyond, have less cognitive decline with age compared to those eating a less healthy diet. And that's true for not just the Mediterranean diet. It's just, there's a lot of evidence for the Mediterranean diet. There's probably other healthy diet options, and the sorts of diets that the Heart Foundation of Australia and the National Health and Medical Research Council are telling us to eat, which is high fruit and vegetable, high complex carbohydrates, a good variety of fresh foods, low saturated fat, healthy protein, are best for our brain as well as for our metabolic health.
So these effects are not momentary effects only. There is effects over time as well, and into older age, depending on how your diet has been, particularly
Yes,
I suppose up to the age.
I think there's no time at which one wouldn't see a benefit of switching to a healthy diet.
Yes.
But there's evidence in monozygotic twins that if looking at twins in middle age, the twin who was heavier at middle age had the greater decline in cognition over time compared to their genetically identical twin. So there's a few studies such as that. There's also, I'm very interested in aging and cognitive decline because we're aging longer, we're living longer. So this is going to become a much bigger health burden for us all. And diet is tractable. There's evidence that if you take a group of elderly people, there was a study in those at risk of frailty, and they changed their diet towards a Mediterranean diet. They showed that they could change the diet over a year in their subjects. They didn't all change, to the same degree, but they could track improvements in measures of frailty that linked with their adherence to the new, healthier diet. So, and they linked to inflammatory mediators as well in a healthy way. So less inflammatory mediators, better outcomes for frailty. And that study actually looked at the gut microbiome in those subjects, which is also part of our interest in this topic, is the interaction between diet, memory, and gut bacteria. And in our laboratory, we've shown that the memory changes are linked to certain changes in the gut microbiome. And that's one of the aspects of this experiment that we're looking at is, are there specific changes in the bacteria induced by the diet that might be related to the memory changes that we're seeing? So we can measure not just the hippocampal genes that are influenced by the diet and how they may be altered and possibly implicated, but also the gut-related microbacteria that we think now are important for behaviours.
I have read an article, not a journal, but an article that did speak about the gut microbiome, experiments in that relating to depression / mood, and that changing microbiome in animals had a moderating effect on how they presented mood-wise. I assume you might be able to say a little bit more about that. That there's a link not only in terms of mood, but obviously mood, behavior, cognitions. I think they all occur in the same animal, same human. And there would have to be a linking in experience. But is that valid? Is that correct? Do you know of that type of research where gut microbiome is a moderating effect on how, if it was swapped over as an example, or changed over time, will actively make I think fairly significant effect size differences?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it's the subject of a lot of research presently, because there's clear evidence that changing our diet affects our microbiome. Our bacteria are important for nutrient harvesting. It's critical for the health of our gut lining, and our immune function is partly driven by a healthy gut. So it affects many systems in our body. And at base, we have two major phyla, firmicutes and bacteroidetes. The ratio of those varies with the quality of our diet. And many things can disrupt that. So smoking, alcohol use, drugs, antibiotics, clearly, and we can change our bacteria relatively quickly. So within days of an unhealthy exposure, it will change, and shifting that balance, I think, is key. How you do that, of course, becomes the issue, and showing the way experiments around the microbiome are run is often using a fecal transfer, because in order to show that there's evidence for the bacteria itself being causally related to whatever your outcome is, that's one of the experimental ways that it's done. And so for depression, as you mentioned, there have been studies showing that transfer of feces from a group of patients who was depressed into healthy mice affected their mood compared to animals who received a control group.
That's exactly what I read, but I didn't read the actual journal.
Yes.
So yeah,
I think it was molecular psychiatry. And there is other evidence because people are clearly interested in knowing, well, can I get the same effect from a probiotic, a mixture of bacteria, like the products you see in the chemist and on the supermarket shelf that contain live bacteria that you can consume and hopefully moderate your gut bacteria. Now, it depends how much take up of that product there is in your own particular gut as to whether you're going to change your microbiome. If I can just digress, we've done experiments in this regard in animals where we've run an experiment where we have a controlled diet or the unhealthy high-fat diet, and we've given animals a probiotic used in humans, which contains 8 bacteria, the sorts of things that you read about, so lactobacillus, bifidobacterium. And we know that our rats on the high-fat, unhealthy diet lose their lactobacillus. If we look in their feces, they're low in that bacterium. So if we supplement those animals with a probiotic, we did see some benefits for the memory loss that we normally observe in the animals who had the probiotic on board. So for cognition, there may be some benefit for replacing the bacteria that are lost with the diet. But we did notice some other not so helpful effects in the healthy animals eating the healthy diet. So you have to be careful what you wish for, I guess.
Sure.
And the one comment I would make here is perhaps we're better off trying to improve our gut microbiome by eating the 5 serves of fruit and vegetables, 5 serves of vegetables at least, and 2 serves of fruit, because the high fiber associated with that are really good at feeding the healthy bacteria that we need to produce the short-chain fatty acids that are useful. Having said that, there are certain conditions where a probiotic might be useful, and there's evidence, I think, now that some studies demonstrate that a probiotic may affect mood in humans. People are still very interested in that question, as an adjunctive therapy or as an approach. But certainly in our animals, it did offset the memory loss that I've described.
That's so fascinating about your work, that the naturalistic model, at least for me, stands for so much, because it allows us to do things like that in terms of, introducing a probiotic. But then you can also see that that is not the solution, because yes, probiotics are useful and all those bacteria are useful, but there are so many other elements that are also valuable in how we naturally get those, or how we feed our gut correctly. Yes, I do see the appeal. As you're speaking, my mind is immediately jumping to solution focused. Go out and buy probiotics. But like a lot of things, there are unintended consequences, or there could be just enormously missed opportunities that it's the harder approach, but that's the point of this conversation of trying to be informed and thinking about how that might apply to myself, to my children.
Sure.
And yet there are certain instances where that would be exactly the right thing to do on a case-by-case situation. But it's interesting to try and understand how, there's so many interactions. My mind is just spinning at the moment. I want to ask so many questions because of that naturalistic setting. Like what one that pops up is, when you provide rats with both healthy foods and unhealthy foods, is there any moderating effect as to how many items are on selection for each. So, for example, the classic idea at home is bring more healthy foods into the home, because you're more likely to therefore reach for something that's healthy because it's on offer. Or, the other version is get rid of some of the unhealthy. But if I just look at my behavior, when I'm looking for a snack at night, I'm not going to the fruit basket. I've got my drawer, and I go into the drawer, have a look, go back to the same drawer, have a look, go back, and keep going with that for that same satiation of that of something that I'm looking for, which clearly is the highly enticing, high fat, high calorie, high sugar. It's just tasty, and so looking from a behavioral change perspective, I'm walking past the fruit basket.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of merit in making healthier food options easy. I find if people cut up fruit for me, I'm much more likely to eat it, right? So we can trick ourselves or help our cohabitants possibly by making it easier.
Yeah.
And I think increasing the amount of it available is useful, normalizing it, I guess. And I think this is where early education, teaching parents and would-be parents and young children. I mean, if you look at young children running around a playground, unencumbered by our biases around food, they tend to eat the healthy stuff, right? I think that they're less likely to be maybe subject to our biases. I mean, another way to think about framing the way we can help ourselves to be healthy and eat well is to think about the fact that the unhealthy foods that I've described increase the level of inflammation in our body. So doing it with food is going to be much better in terms of your overall inflammatory state. And so that's maybe making food attractive as opposed to the non-food options that we spoke about, because it's the food, I think, and the healthy components within the food that are most beneficial. But of course, in some settings, you may want to have a probiotic if you've had antibiotic treatment, or
Sure.
As we said, there are some settings. I think,
Can I jump on a small tangent while it's still in my brain?
Sure.
With the keeping the inflammatory response low, I've also read around stress as a moderator around inflammatory responses. Can you talk me through that relationship? Maybe finishing up on what you were thinking, and maybe tying in the stress component.
Sure. So the hippocampal memory loss that I discussed in our rats induced by the high-fat diet, the degree of memory reduction is correlated with the expression of inflammatory genes in the hippocampus of the brain of those animals. So tumor necrosis factor alpha is increased by the diet, and the higher the TNF alpha in the hippocampus, the lower the memory score of the rats. So we think that essentially inflammation is important. The blood-brain barrier is probably leakier, induced by that inflammatory response. And so that's why, and there's now even an inflammatory diet score. So the foods that we're talking about in humans are thought to be inflammatory for us. So I think, it may be a tractable way to think about it for people. If you're reducing inflammation, you're going to be doing a whole lot of good things for all of your body. And that may be a tractable goal. So the way I like to talk about this is, if you don't care about your body, think about preserving your brain function for the next several decades by eating well. So the way we think and the way we interact with others may be a much more powerful goal for people to improve their health. And you're right around stress and inflammation, because there's a clear nexus there. It's not our main focus, but we know that stress will impact what we eat, and we may reach for those foods. And again, there's many decades of animal evidence around the fact that providing animals with food that they find rewarding or comforting does reduce cortisol levels or dampens their response to stress. So again, there's a physiological underpinning of that reaction, even though it's metabolically unhelpful in the long term.
Sure. There's an immediate comfort, and it activates the, I suppose, like the sympathetic nervous system, say it's okay, and reduces that. But obviously, you can't use that as your primary coping mechanism.
Again, early experiments in our hands also showed that if we had animals that were stressed but they had access to an exercise wheel, that also moderated their psychopathology. So again, as we know, exercise is a great circuit breaker for some people around stress and mood, and so that may also be of benefit.
You have been involved in this for an incredibly long period of time, and I imagine you've given, countless hours of thought and consideration, and spoken with colleagues who are also incredibly bright. What are some of the takeaways of, how can we set up our environment, or what should we be thinking about? I know you mentioned trying to think about our inflammatory markers, so to speak, or think about it in that way. For listeners who are thinking about this and saying, yeah, maybe I could go out and re-examine my diet. I see the importance of this, whether it's to show to my children, or whether it's for later on in age, or whether it's my immediate improvement in memory. What are some things that you have either applied for yourself, or you've encouraged others, or recommendations that have come out of your work that you see as being tangible, manageable ways of thinking, even that come out of all of this? I'm so excited to hear this. To me, I could listen to this all day because it's so fascinating, and the replication of that real world. But I like little jolts, or little tips, or little moments to say, yeah, that's landed really well. It's a good way to think that I can kind of take away and hopefully preserve it for a little bit longer before I go to that drawer of mine. How can we think about this a little bit different, or what have you found has been potentially useful?
I think some takeaways from our actual experiments are, if we feed animals, we've done a dose effect response to the diet effectively by giving the animals different amounts of the different days on that diet to see, what's the minimum bad amount of food you have to eat to have an effect on your brains. And it's, it kicks in at about 3 or 4 days a week, four days a week, So don't sweat it if you have a big weekend and you have a nice time. You still have to be able to do that, because we all have to live.
Yes.
Right. We have to live. We have to be happy. We have to celebrate. Food's a big part of our culture, every culture. And so having a feast day isn't going to, mess you up, provided you can get back to a healthy equilibrium. So I think that's one to take home. I think
that's great
variety.
That's
I
really
think your
great.
point about variety of healthy foods, like I'm trying to eat lots of vegetables because that's my tack at the moment. And I think once you retrain yourself, there's an amazing. I think if you can change your diet towards a healthy style diet, and it's taken me decades to be able to do that, I have to say, it is actually really yummy. And eating food, I think the other hint, I suppose, is eating food. There's this famous saying, and I forget the author, who said, eat food that your grandmother would recognize as food. and it's probably a great-grandmother now, but
True.
and it's true, right? Things in a packet, things that are processed, and we talk about ultra-processed foods now. We've just been looking at the emulsifiers and the ingredients, because we're now trying to add that to our mix. Of the foods that we eat, do the amount of additives have an impact on our outcomes in our experiments? So eating real foods, like fresh things that you don't get in a packet. I think I eat a lot of pulses and, things that you have to cook from scratch, like experimenting with food and making things is fun. And I guess you can start doing that with kids, right? The garden experiments, the growing the food, the seeing where it comes from, I think is really beneficial.
Taking an interest. It seems to me, if I reflect on it myself, there are certainly long periods where I deviate away from what we are discussing and completely forget about it. But the importance of coming back and re-examining and saying, hey, let's give this another crack. It's not necessarily a forever. Certainly shouldn't be so rigid that it's not doable. And I love that commentary around being able to let your hair down and that still being part of life, because the food is so enjoyable, but doing in a way that has both sides, and not necessarily always in equal doses. I just came back from an extended period overseas to see my family, my wife's family, and I can tell you, on every single day, I must have ticked all the wrong boxes, and at the same time, that's exactly what I intended to do. I wanted to do that because you don't get that opportunity very many times. But coming back, there obviously has to be, well, my apologies, it doesn't have to be, but it's important that I have that in mind, and I actually gave myself great permission to do so. And, with some consideration of how I might like to do things upon my return. So I like that balance and that just continually trying. And this is a fantastic reminder. And also a bit of a shock, to tell the truth. Is 5% only, of veg and fruit. If I look at my own diet, if I would actually look at my plate and all the snacks that aren't on my plate, but you graze throughout the day or whatever it might be, I must be in that 5% quite comfortably as well. I need to improve. So my apologies. I want to improve and be more conscious, without that negativity. Give it another crack. When I fall off the horse, give it another crack again. And that's what I'm hearing from you, that you've got a current little regime that you're working on as well. And you've been in this space for a long period of time. So it's encouraging. I like that.
The other thing I think is exercise. I broke my wrist 18 months ago, and so I've responded by trying to lift more weights because I was a bit horrified at my bone density. And it's hard to describe to people, I think, how good it feels to be fit. I think it's probably something that we forget about, Again, little kids run around, they're lean, it's a very good feeling, and it's very hard to describe to people. And part of our research program is around exercise. I'm a pharmacologist, so I'm not averse to thinking about drug remedies for things at all. And we've looked at exercise mimetics. But if we put exercise head to head with, a mitochondrial activator, exercise is the best drug out. So in the body weight space, in the cognition space, in the depression space, exercise is the best thing in our toolkit. And again, if we can all make enough time in our busy lives, and I think this is the other thing about our environment, it's becoming harder and harder. So I teach exercise physiology students, actually. And a long time ago, I was talking to them about how I'm struggling to get enough activity in my day. And they said, why don't you just stop using the lift? And I thought, oh, God, I can't do that. Well, I did, damn it. And it took a while to be able to, my office is on the 3rd floor. I never used the lift. I'm now just known as the person who doesn't use the lift. It's a really easy thing to do. And if you could incorporate it, and I walk 15,000 steps a day. Now, that's slightly too many, probably, for a lot of us, but I get up early. I live near a very big park, and I march up and down the hills because I mentioned cardiovascular. I have strong family history of heart disease. And I know that exercise is really good for your blood pressure. So if you're thinking about self-care and self-preservation, as you talked about, it's a pretty easy thing. Exercise.
It's a wonderful point, because I've also read that studies that have put exercise up against antidepressants, and that exercise has not only equaled but outperformed antidepressants by a significant margin, is what I've read. And once again, when we look at the inflammatory response, or if we look at how one feels when you've got strength, I know of every time I've spoken to a client who reports getting into a new exercise regime, or they've started type of exercise, not once have I heard them say this is awful. Yes, we might chuckle about, you're a bit sore in your muscles, but even then there's a bit of a celebration going on, because it's saying, I did some work yesterday. There's something nice about that, and I'm sure it's much more complicated as to what all the biological interactions and the like are occurring, but there's something powerful about it. And once again, I think it does moderate our choice of food as well, because I know from personal experience and from clients as well, they change their selection of food when they're exercising, maybe because they're more cognizant, or maybe it changes your cognitions, and so you do have more time to change, or more insights to select something different. There's certainly something going on, but it's a really good point that you raise there. Almost like a prescription or a script of exercise, like kind of like antibiotics. You got 10 days of it. Even if you feel better, don't stop. Maybe 10 days of exercise, even if you feel better, don't stop.
Yeah. Exercise does, in fact, increase brain-derived neurotrophic factor in the brain, which is thought to be part of the mechanism maybe of some of the antidepressants. So there is some biological underpinning, we think, of that.
It's refreshing to hear from someone like you that knows so much about the different approaches, and it's not a one size fits all, but I can see a clear leaning about how we can try and improve our diet, the importance of it, not only on a immediate response, for example, memory, cognitions and the like, but also a bit of a longer term in terms of our mental well-being, depression, but also how our body degenerates over time, and how that that response, that inflammatory response, might actually increase degeneration quicker, and whether we note it now or not, it will catch up with us. And it's an important thing that we think about today. And we've got an aging population. That's we've always got an aging population, not in terms of statistically, but all of us are moving in the same direction. It's really important that we think about that. and being able to just continue to try and be informed by conversations like this. Where can people find out more about your work, or how can people get involved? There might be students even listening. You can talk about how someone could get into the type of work that you're doing. This naturalistic approach sounds absolutely marvelous.
People can find my publications if they go to the University of New South Wales website and search my name, Margaret Morris. It should come up with a link to my research page, which has publications on it. So the diet work, the microbiome work, some of the stress work is all published. I have a review paper published in 2015 that's titled "Why is Obesity Such a Problem in the 21st Century?", which touches on some of these concepts around the interaction really between diet, our environment, stress, and cognition. So it's possibly relevant. That's probably the simplest approach at the first point.
Sure.
I'm happy to talk to people if they have specific questions. If they want to email me, my email address is on the website.
Lovely. They can reach out there as well. Any good books that extend on this, or easily accessible, or even texts that talk about these as stimulators? That they won't obviously cover the whole entire amount. Anything that you can point to, or websites?
Oh, you've caught me now.
And there doesn't need to be. I just
nothing off the top of my head. Sorry.
No, look, it's been lovely, and I'm more than happy as well to host any of these publications. If they're easily accessible, you can send them through, and I can link them to the show notes so that those
absolutely
can find it. But as you said, you can just go to Margaret Morris at UNSW and find all those publications there as well. Thank you so much for your time, and even more importantly, a genuine thank you for the work that you've done in your career, and I hope many more years to come through that as well. I think this body of knowledge is so important. I'm such a believer in the scientific method. It's part of what it's almost like a religion for me. But I think complementing this also with really great consideration around the naturalistic model, the naturalistic approach is so important, because I think we can extrapolate more ideas from it, more theories, and ask even more improved questions. And I think some of that stands for itself in terms of how I can apply it. I think for myself, hearing about those studies inspires me more to try a little bit harder to get back on the horse and try my own experiments yet again, because we need those reminders. So thank you so much for your time today, your expertise, appreciate being able to talk to you.
Thank you so much for your interest. I should add that I'm really grateful for all of the work done by the fantastic students and colleagues that I've had over the years. But also I'm really privileged to have been able to be funded by NHMRC and ARC to be able to do this work. It hasn't always been easy. I mean, talking to people about our diet possibly affecting cognition 10 years ago, we were kind of laughed at by some of the reviewers. And the notion that a mother's diet could impact the offspring. But, I persevered, and I felt really privileged to have been able to actually do the work. As a researcher, your topic is really your passion, and it's been a really great thing to be able to do. So thank you so much for talking to me about it.
No, my pleasure. And I think that's one of the beautiful things around those types of grants is that it's nice to hear that they're not always going for what is popular or what is sexy, so to speak, but rather than that, looking at what's important. And this sort of research is incredibly important because the actual implications are widespread and should be promoted as much as possible so that we are reminded. It doesn't just get left in journals. It gets discussed and obviously passed on to the next generation that build upon it. So it's lovely as well to hear you acknowledge all of your students and colleagues and the like, because I think that's what this is. It's a team effort for the community. And I appreciate you immensely.
Thank you.